Welcome to the Urban Climate Adaptation Virtual Symposium hosted by the USGS National Climate Adaptation Science Center. If you're rejoining after the break, welcome back. We have had an excellent afternoon of inspiring speakers discussing everything from advancing justice through actionable science, transformative adaptation, equitable partnerships centered around urban water resources, and local federal collaborations to enhance access to nature for urban residents. Once we wrap up our final panel session that is about to begin, you're invited to engage further on these topics during an hour-long discussion session beginning at 4:30 Eastern. The discussion session has a separate limited registration that can be accessed at the bottom of the event webpage. So if you'd like to participate, please be sure to register. You can also check back on the webpage in several weeks to months if you'd like to access recordings of any part of the symposium today. Now we'll move on to exploring examples of urban climate adaptation research. Our panel, titled Research Spotlights on Urban Climate Impacts and Adaptation Strategies, will showcase emerging work of 6 researchers, each presenting a 5-minute research lightning talk. These projects span a variety of urban climate impacts and adaptation strategies, including projecting future urbanization, flood resilience, stormwater management, urban tree resilience, and community experiences in arid climates. Many of these projects are just taking off, providing an opportunity to share for researchers to share the very early stages of this work. I want to welcome Georgina Sanchez, Amanda Carlson, Katie Powlin, Ann Jefferson, and Stacia Ryder. Unfortunately, Meredith Martin won't be joining us today, but as a reminder, full bios for all of our speakers can be found on the event webpage. Following this panel session, we'll have a panel-style audience Q&A where audience members are encouraged to engage with our speakers during the last 10 to 15 minutes of the session by submitting questions using the chat and using the raise hand feature. If submitting a question for a specific panelist, please be sure to specify who your question is for. To our panelists today, thank you all for joining us. Georgina, I'll pass things off to you to start our research spotlights. You can now take control of the presentation.
All right, thank you, Mia. Can everyone hear me, see me, and see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect, thanks. As Mia mentioned, my name is Georgina Sanchez. I'm a faculty fellow and a research scholar with the Center for Geospatial Analytics at North Carolina State University. I'm also leading the CCASC-funded project predicting interactions between demographic change, climate adaptations, and conservation actions across the U.S. Caribbean. In both news and everyday conversations, it's increasingly common for us to discuss how climate change influences the way in which we make decisions about where to live and how, and that happens now and in the future. Understanding and predicting future land change dynamics has become crucial to guide long-term resilience planning and conservation actions. Land change science has long assisted natural resource managers in understanding the ecological impacts of future urbanization. Together, we explore what-if scenarios, or we test not yet enacted management strategies to then evaluate outcomes and compare trade-offs. Now, as conditions evolve and new challenges arise, there is a constant opportunity to improve land change models. One gap that remains is that our models haven't quite yet captured the dynamics in areas where new homes are built despite trends in population decline due to climate and economic distress. Our project will build partnerships with policymakers and natural resource managers involved in the managing and protecting of areas involved in climate adaptation and land use planning, so that together we can co-create a new kind of land change model. Our approach will consider a number of socioeconomic, environmental, and governance factors. to simulate development processes decoupled from population growth. Super important, and hopefully you've already noticed that based on my slides and title, is that our work will be conducted in the US Caribbean region. Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands are experiencing high levels of outmigration caused by economic and climate stress, with population declines of about 17% since peak levels in 2017. Paradoxically, despite population declines, new residential development continues and is often near protected areas or in areas of potential conservation need. Considering the Caribbean susceptibility to climate change, ongoing growth fueled by natural amenities, and historical research neglect, it presents a great opportunity for us to develop and validate these models. Our project leverages recent advancements to the Futures Land Change model. Some of you might be familiar with the work that we have done in the past, where now we're able to simulate interactions between urban growth, increased flooding, and human adaptive capacity. Our aim is to produce future land change projections similar and comparable to those generated for the inland Southeast region in prior USGS funded initiatives. You can scan this QR code to learn a little bit more about futures and some of the applications that we're working on or have worked in the past. And you can also try the model yourself. As many of you may know, we work under a strong open science philosophy, and futures is accessible through GrassGIS. Well, thank you. And now I'll pass it to Amanda. So Amanda, if you can please take control.
Okay, thank you, Georgina. So my name is Amanda Carlson, and I am a postdoc at the USGS Geosciences and Environmental Change Science Center. And I am going to be telling you about our work mapping and assessing wildfire building destruction in the United States. So we have always lived with wildfire, but wildfire disasters have been increasing in recent years as a result of two factors. Number one, burned area is increasing, largely driven by climate change. But also at the same time, we are continually building new developments into the wildland-urban interface. So more buildings are butting right up against wildland vegetation and crossing the paths of major wildfires. So in the last several years, we've seen large wildfire disasters, such as the 2018 Camp Fire that destroyed the town of Paradise, California, and the 2021 fires in Boulder County, Colorado. We've also seen wildfire disasters in areas that have don't typically experience wildfires, or that we don't think of as typically experiencing wildfires, including the fires in Lahaina, Hawaii last year. And most recently, we had the destructive wildfires in northern Texas just last month. And so we need data to assess these wildfire disasters in order to understand the overall patterns and prepare accordingly, and also to understand some of the factors that are contributing to wildfire building loss. So currently, some of the best available data sets we have include the ICS 209 database collected by FEMA, which includes incident reports from firefighting agencies and includes counts of damage and destroyed buildings for wildfire events. However, this does not include the actual locations of buildings. So that type of data, that point location data, is available through CAL FIRE, but it's only available for California. They record the actual locations of destroyed and damaged buildings, but not necessarily the locations of undamaged buildings for all wildfire events. So presently, there is no point location data set for the entire United States that contains all damaged and exposed buildings. So that is where our work comes in. Our project that we are working on now is to create a complete wildfire building loss data set for the conterminous United States, covering 2014 to 2020. This is being done through manual digitization. We have a team of student contractors and GIS techs who are downloading wildfire parameters through monitoring trends and burn severity. They're downloading pre and post-fire imagery, primarily from NAPE, also using Google Earth and other available sources, and just doing a lot of scrolling around, clicking, and identifying buildings that are present inside the wildfire parameters and marking them as either exposed, unburned, or destroyed. So this includes all buildings inside the wildfire perimeters, as well as within a 2.4-kilometer buffer, matching the definition of the wildland-urban interface. And because of this is a labor-intensive process, we are currently only including events that destroyed at least 10 or more structures. So this data set is nearing completion. We're hard at work on it. So what do we plan to do with it once it's done? So the first analysis is just a fairly broad scale assessment of overall wildfire building loss patterns. So using that spatially precise data set, that will allow us to compare wildfire building loss patterns to those predicted by wildfire risk models, such as the wildfire risk communities. And that will allow us to determine where are our risk models performing well and allowing us to anticipate and prepare for wildfire disasters, and where can we potentially do better. And this fine scale data set also allows us to do much more fine-grained analyses as well within individual wildfire events. So a question we're particularly interested in is looking at the effect of defensible space around homes. If we can use those locations of buildings that were either destroyed or left behind by the wildfires, can map the defensible space from the pre-fire imagery, we can determine what effect that might have on wildfire likelihood. And you can do this with many other factors as well. You can look at, for example, road networks that allow wildfire or firefighter access. You can look at the effects of fuel types and treatments. You can look at effects of building configuration and density under various scenarios and in different fuel types. So ultimately, this will be a publicly available data set. Researchers can download it and apply it to whatever questions they may have. So in this way, we can hopefully learn from patterns of past disasters to prevent future disasters. So thank you. I'll hand it over to Katie.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. I'm Katie, and I'm a geographer with the Oklahoma-Texas Water Science Center. The project I'll be presenting on today is a quick overview of my project on flood mitigation in Texas, which was recently selected for funding by the South Central CASC and is planned to start later this year. So Harris County is located in southeastern Texas near the Gulf of Mexico. It covers much of the city of Houston, as you can see from the coverage of red colors in the land cover map. Another key characteristic about the county is its network of bayous, or natural slow-moving water features that cross the country. When well planned for, these bayous can make very scenic parks, and in other cases can lead to very high flooding risk for neighboring residents. So Harris County and its drainage features have been put to the test in recent years with a number of catastrophic flooding events. One of the most notable events being Hurricane Harvey in 2017, which caused $125 billion worth of damage and numerous casualties. So as climate change leads to a more frequent and severe tropical storms and other flooding events, flood mitigation will be critical for the region to protect its residents and infrastructure. An increasingly popular flood mitigation strategy across the U.S. are property buyouts or property acquisition programs or flood buyouts. Buyouts are thought to be a last resort solution when structural solutions will not effectively reduce flood risk. They can look a little different, but are typically voluntary, federally funded through agencies like FEMA or HUD, and administered through local governments. And in a buyout program, the local government purchases a property that has experienced repetitive flood loss, providing the homeowner with funds to move outside of a flood zone. And then in cases with continued investment, those purchased properties can be converted back into green spaces or a type of nature-based solutions, which could provide flood mitigation for the remaining residents in surrounding areas. These green spaces also have a number of other ecosystem service benefits as well as well-being benefits. And due to the fact that Texas is at increasing risk for severe flooding as well as extreme heat, strategies which can increase tree cover in urban areas could be looked at as a multi-hazard solution. So Harris County has one of the highest concentrations of buyouts across the U.S. Most of the buyouts are administered through the Harris County Flood Control District, who's purchased more than 3,000 properties since the program began in 1985. And this is really just the start. They're hoping to purchase more than another 5,000 homes to effectively reduce flood risk across the county. And this will have major financial implications, which will be the major challenge given the limited number of funds available for these programs. So the project that we proposed is to come up with a strategy to identify the areas most in need and the communities most in need of bio investments based on a number of factors, including exposure to floods, community sensitivity to flooding effects, as well as historic flood mitigation investments. So to do this project will have 4 components. The first being flood modeling in order to understand the current extent of flood exposure, as well as exposure under future climate scenarios. We will also identify the communities most sensitive to flooding based on community characteristics by building off of existing social vulnerability or flood vulnerability indices. There'll be a geospatial component, which will look at the distribution of purchased properties in the past, as well as the extent to which they've been converted to green space in order to understand where purchased properties have removed a single family from harm versus continued to provide flood mitigation support for remaining residents. And then, of course, because it is always more complicated than just asking somebody to leave their home, there'll also be a community engagement piece to this project through public meetings or focus groups with high-risk flood homeowners in order to understand what are some of the factors preventing or potentially encouraging buy-in into these voluntary programs. We plan to synthesize this information into a single report, which will be shared with project partners, including the Flood Control District, which can help identify new priority areas, either for purchasing properties or for further investment to develop out nature-based solutions across the county to protect remaining residents. With that, I just wanted to acknowledge a couple other team members who are also with the Oklahoma Texas Water Science Center, Namjung and Nathan, as well as our advisory board who has agreed to support the project over the next 3 years. And with that, I will pass it on to Anne.
All right, thank you. I'm Ann Jefferson. I am a professor at the University of Vermont Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources, and I'm going to tell you about a soon-to-be started project on climate adaptation for stormwater management to protect urban streams in collaboration with the Northeastern CASC. So why focus in on stormwater management in the Northeastern United States? First, 65 million Americans, that's 20% of our US population, live in urban areas in the region served by the Northeastern CASC from Maine to Kentucky. And while heavy precipitation is increasing in many parts of the United States, the Northeastern United States has seen heavier increases than many other regions. So the map diagram at the bottom of this screen shows official government estimates of a 100-year storm based on historical data, updated though to show how frequently that storm, which used to occur on average once every 100 years, now occurs in this region. And so we can see that in the Northeastern United States, that 1 in a 100-year storm is now really a 1 in 60-year storm, or about twice as frequent. In urban areas, we build infrastructure around these sort of 1 in 100 year or 1 in 2 year, 1 in 5 years sort of storms. And we essentially build our urban environment, our stormwater management, our drainage infrastructure based on historical data and historical climatology, essentially locking our cities into climates that no longer exist. And we know that changes are going to continue. So the dotty plot on the right is showing some modeling we did for an urban stream in northeastern Ohio, showing projected changes in 2-year stream flow by the end of the 21st century. And those estimates range from increasing 25% to increasing 120% over the course of this century. So these changes are going to continue if we don't update and adapt our stormwater management strategies. These more extreme flows within urban watersheds will then have degrading effects on stream ecosystems. So in order to understand how climate change is going to impact urban stream ecosystems, we really have to think about it from a coupled human natural systems perspective. And this is a framework that I've been working with, focusing on urban streams over and developing over about the last 15 years, starting with the evaluating individual and institutional decision-making in terms of what gets built and done on the ground in terms of engineering and environmental practices, and then how those practices influence flow regime, water quality, and ultimately ecosystem health. So we're just wrapping up a collaborative multi-year NSF project that used this framework. And before I dig into the new project, I just wanted to give you sort of a peek at one of the results from this previous study. So in the study, we were very interested in what influences stormwater decision makers and the processes of choosing types of stormwater management and green infrastructure, and where, when, how they do it. So we did a survey of 185 stormwater professionals in Cleveland, Ohio, and Denver, Colorado. And the graph I'm showing you here shows that their primary stormwater goals differ across the cities, which we attribute to differences in the regulatory context between these two cities and states. But when not shown, when we get into secondary goals, we see that things like individual attitudes and values really start to shape the types of decisions about stormwater management that are made. So looking forward then to this project that we're going to launch this fall, I'm really excited to bring climate change into the diagram here, looking at how climate change is influencing the decision-making process and how it's influencing the flow regime, and then all the feedbacks within the system. So our project goals are to assess and evaluate climate adaptation strategies for stormwater management in the northeastern United States, with a regional perspective stretching from Maine to Kentucky, but a particular focus in on 6 to 10 study cities. And then as we learn what is happening in this space, we want to share back the actionable science on the transferable and effective strategies for supporting the ecosystem services that urban streams provide us. So we're going to be answering 3 main questions. The first is, what adaptation strategies are already being implemented? They're in progress, they're in ordinances, they're going in on the ground. What are planned? So they appear in planning documents and strategies, but haven't yet been implemented. And what are stormwater managers interested in knowing more about? What do they want to know? They haven't formalized anything yet, but they'd love to know more. And we're going to find this out through document analyses of ordinances, regulations, and plans, with interviews with our stormwater managers. Those 2 activities will take place in our 6 to 10 study cities, and then we'll do a broader survey of stormwater managers throughout the region. Our second question is, how effective and transferable are those strategies that stormwater managers are implementing, planning, or interested in at mitigating climate change effects on urban stream flow? And here we're going to dig into the hard science, look at climate change projections for our study cities, implement swim models associated with some of those different adaptation strategies that may be of interest. And we're going to force them not only with current and future climate for a study city that identified that strategy as of interest or being implemented or planned, but also look at a wide range of climates throughout the region so that we can understand what strategies might be transferable and effective across the region. Ultimately, our ecosystem services are a function not just of flow, but also of water quality. So we will evaluate how effective and transferable those stormwater management strategies are for mitigating material fluxes, with a particular focus on sediment and phosphorus. We're largely going to take a data synthesis approach here, but we identified in our preliminary research a gap in northern New England, so we will also be conducting field work in Vermont. And then based on the changing flow regime and water quality, we'll work through the implications for ecosystem services in the urban streams of the northeastern US. And again, it's not enough to do interesting science. We want to make sure to share it back with decision makers and scientists. We have local connections already established in the Burlington, Vermont area. We're going to be working with stormwater utilities in Chittenden County, Burlington, Vermont, throughout the project, listening to their feedback, sharing the data back as we collect it, etc. And then we're going to build that out in our other study cities as well. And then as project results start to come in, we'll be sharing that out in fact sheets and webinars tailored to particular subregions within this very broad northeastern United States. And then ultimately also sharing out with stormwater managers, practitioners, decision makers, scientists, and engineers at the national scale through webinars, conferences, and other activities. All right. And with that, I will hand it off to Stacia.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Stacia Ryder. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white woman with brown hair wearing a black top. And I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Utah State University. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Southwest Task-funded project that I'm leading, focusing on mapping community experiences and concerns related to drying lakes in arid climates. So the issue, let me see if I can get the, oh no, there we go, okay. So over the last 3 decades, over half of the world's largest lakes and reservoirs have been experiencing water loss, but about a quarter of the world's population also live in lake basins that are drying. So dealing with drying lake systems is in the long term going to be a really important issue. The project that I'm working on focuses on 4 major lakes in the western US of concern: Lake Powell, Lake Mead, the Salton Sea, and the Great Salt Lake. And the proposal focuses primarily on the Great Salt Lake. Oh no, they're not advancing. Okay, if I do that, does that work? Is that moving it forward?
Have you taken control of the PowerPoint?
Oh, that's why. Sorry.
Looks great. Thank you.
Okay, are we now on the drying lake slide? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so anyway, the bulk of this project will focus on the Great Salt Lake, but working on making connections across the other communities as well for future collaboration. So the Great Salt Lake problem, there are some unique and non-unique factors here. There are a lot of stresses on the water consumptive use in terms of agricultural and growing municipalities. You can see the circle on the right-hand side shows where the water is going. So we see a decrease in water levels and an increase in aridification. Part of this is due to climate change. Climate change is also just exacerbating these already existing problems. And so in 2022, the surface area of the lake was only half of its average. We had a couple of wet years, but that's insufficient for addressing the long-term problem. So you may have become familiar with this when the New York Times did a piece on it, and they called the Great Salt Lake Utah's environmental nuclear bomb. Just to give you an idea of the scale of what's happening, here is a picture of the lake in 1987. And this 2022. So I'll go back one more time, just because I think this visual is really important. 1987 and 2022. So some of the consequences, we're seeing impacts to the ecosystem, diminishing quality of life in Utah, and it's threatening human and non-human health. So there are a lot of animals that depend on the lake system. But what's probably of most interest to people here are that what's happening is that the dust, as the lake bed is decreasing, there's a lot more lake bed dust that's getting picked up by the wind, and that has high levels of arsenic and some other toxins in it. And then the wind blows that directly towards Salt Lake City, which is the biggest urban area in the state of Utah. And it, of course, is not blowing the pollution. It's not getting distributed equally across the city. The patterns are suggesting that it's going to exacerbate unequal exposure to air pollution that already exists for low-income communities of color, such as the West Valley. That's one of the more prominent areas that's been in the spotlight. And some of those pre-existing air quality issues are Interstate 15, the Salt Lake City Airport, rail lines, and refineries. So US Magnesium is one of the big industries there, and there are also oil and gas refineries as well. So the project, we're working with two organizations, Healthy Environment Alliance of Utah and the Utah Youth Environmental Solutions organization, to explore how urban communities around the Great Salt Lake are experiencing these decreasing water levels, and also trying to think about what they think we should do about it so that these approaches are co-produced. So the research questions are, how are the changes tied to this drying lake being observed, experienced, and understood? And how are the sensory experiences informing risk perceptions around shrinking lakes, specifically the Great Salt Lake? What strategies for mitigating or adapting to these risks do local residents support? And what are the unequal or unintended impacts of some of the currently proposed resource management solutions, the policies that are being pushed forward by the state legislature? So ultimately, the goal of the project is to develop effective, inclusive, and fair plans, that's my timer, for conserving lakes, saving culturally important places, and protecting people's health. So we're going to be doing workshop sessions with residents, and there will be several different sub-sessions within these workshops. One will focus on sense of place, one will focus on participatory mapping, one will focus on body mapping, and one will focus on developing action cards that hopefully can be used across different lake systems to think about how we can mitigate and adapt to these problems. The body mapping is about public health, documenting physical changes. Participatory mapping is marking out spaces, locations of importance, places that residents might fear are going to be permanently altered. And then sense of place is sort of how changes to these places will impact their connections to the places and the people around them. And then the biggest thing is, while we're thinking about what can we do long-term about these issues, we also recognize, like I said, that there are already air pollution issues in the city. And so everyone that participates will do a DIY air filter session. So we'll provide all of the materials for people to build air filters at the workshop, and they can take those home and have them in their home to start already sort of reducing exposure to the air pollution that they already face. Of course, sharing the results is really important. So we think these workshops will allow residents to map important aspects of the local lakes and demonstrate their concerns. And so we'll be sharing results through community reports and policy briefs. We're doing knowledge exchange events in the community, and we'll also be doing events to check back in with community members to make sure that what we're doing aligns with what we think we're capturing here. And then we'll be producing those climate adaptation card decks that we'll share. They'll be open source in an online photo voice gallery. So I just want to say thank you. And I think at this point, we turn it over for questions. So I will go to the next slide.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. That was wonderful. We're going to be doing our question and answer session again, where we will go, once again, if you would like to ask a question, you can either do so through the chat, or you can do so by raising your hand, and I'll call on you and then allow you to have your mic and your camera on. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing the screen so we can see all of our presenters. So presenters, if you guys would like to come back on camera. Okie, and we're going to get started with a couple of questions from the chat. So to begin with, Anne, can you talk more about how you selected the 6 to 10 study cities in the very large region from Maine to Kentucky?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're actually still in process of doing that because our project hasn't started yet. It's sort of a multi-pronged process because we want geographic spread, and we also want community size and attribute spread as well. But we have some like broad areas in mind. Because of the data synthesis element, we're also using USGS gauge data and water quality data to help inform candidate cities that we might look at so that we can actually give them water quality information that's relevant to their particular community and region. But we also really highly value having enthusiastic partners. And so I haven't named those cities yet because I want to reach out to the stormwater management and decision makers in the communities and make sure that they are going to be interested in, feel like they're going to get some benefit from this project and get them on board before I name them publicly.
You. And now a question for Stacia. You mentioned co-production as an approach to this project. Can you elaborate on this approach for many who are not familiar? And this can also be opened up to other panelists too, like what does co-production mean to you, and how do you apply it to your work?
Yeah, so the idea of co-production in my mind is rooted in transdisciplinary approaches to developing knowledge. So how do we go outside of the academy and make sure that we are building knowledge together with people that are not just researchers? And so for this project, we have already started doing that in the proposal stage. We worked with HEAL as well as a couple of community organizations out of the Salton Sea to talk about what they thought would be useful, and actually also an organization in Lake Mead, how this project could work to help inform future decision making. We'll also have an advisory board that will consist of nonprofit organizations that are involved in, involved in these lake systems, basically. Or in the case of the Salton Sea and the Great Salt Lake, there are several community-based organizations because those are both saline lakes, and so the impacts of those drying are a little bit different. And then we have, ideally, we will be, anything we're producing and writing and outputs will be co-written, and co-credit will be given to our community group members that are also involved in this. So we'll be writing and checking back in with them throughout the process. And then I think culminating in those knowledge exchange events where we kind of talk through what we've done, where we've come, whether the products we think are kind of final are in line with what the community thinks, and then hopefully move forward to do more of the same stuff in the Lake Powell, Lake Mead, and Salton Sea, and seeing how we can learn from, like the Salton Sea, for example, the drying, they're a little bit further along, for worse, really. It's not a positive thing, but we're hoping to learn from how some of the organizations in the Salton Sea have handled what's happened there. So it's about building those connections too for continuing to produce information that's valuable across different communities experiencing these same things.
So much. Does anybody else want to jump in and talk about co-production anyway?
I'll just jump in and say, so one of the aspects of co-production in our work is really this idea that the stormwater managers that we're interviewing and talking to and surveying are going to tell us what climate adaptation strategies we should be exploring in our models. And so we're not coming in with we're going to model a wet pond, we're going to model a rain garden, pick your favorite type of green infrastructure here, but we really want to know what it is that the decision makers need to know about before we proceed with this work. So it's not fully them telling us how to write the proposal from the start, but it has elements of co-production throughout the process.
We're going to go to a question from the chat. How successful have these different projects been in engaging Indigenous community members? How likely are you to build in traditional land uses to help build resilience?
I'm not sure who this is directed at exactly, but I can just talk about my experience. So before coming to Utah State in August of last year, I had been living and working in the UK for the last 4.5 years. And so I have none of my work around environmental and climate justice has been working with Indigenous community members. Because of that, I'm pretty careful about how I approach them. I don't think it's appropriate for me to just start working with tribes without having any experience or being informed about that. In the Western US, obviously, tribes are a really important stakeholder. I don't always love the word stakeholder, but that's kind of the best word we have, I suppose. And so I have reached out to them, and I haven't gotten any responses. And part of the reason that we scaled back our project to focus first on the Great Salt Lake is because we have more connections around the Great Salt Lake. And so we felt that it was appropriate to take the 2 years and focus on Great Salt Lake and then build networks in these other lake systems so that we can try and consult and work with tribes and other stakeholders, but we just recognize that that takes time and trust building and experience, and bringing people onto the team that have that experience.
I can answer that question as well. So my talk didn't really focus on this because it focused on a fairly narrow slice of the broader project that I'm working on. But our overall project that my team is working on is to assess wildfire risk assessment products in order to guide and direct management efforts through the bipartisan infrastructure law. So one component of that is to assess how risk assessments work on BIA lands or tribal lands. Because one of the things that we recognized is that wildfire risk assessments focus very heavily on building loss, and my work is all focused on mapping buildings. So like that's clearly an important component, but that really falls short on tribal lands because most of the feedback we've gotten from the tribes is that buildings are just one of the many resources that they care about, and often not the most important resource. So there are more important cultural resources and ecological resources that can be impacted by wildfire. So that is another goal of the work that I'm involved in, is to try to develop risk assessment models that also account for some of those tribal values by holding workshops with the tribes and getting their feedback and directing different risk assessment approaches.
We'll now go to a live question from Sabria again. Hold on, I'm allowing the mic, allowing the camera. Okay, you should be able to come on and ask your question.
Thank you, and it is Kimbria, just to let you know.
Kimbria, I'm sorry.
That's okay, Amanda. That was great what you just said about reaching out, and I think what we of the colonial backgrounds don't understand is all the damage that's done. The way that the original keynote speaker was talking about, none of this was by accident. This was on purpose, and we need to. There's so much work that needs to be done before we can actually do the work in building those relationships and showing up, honoring the land. One thing I would recommend is that if you are holding a meeting, invite Indigenous people to come and bless the meeting, bring in ceremony, be serious and intentional about how you're incorporating them and bringing in their culture. There's so much healing that has to be done before we can actually even do the work that represents the community members. So it's just we're fighting, centuries, and there's a lot of healing that has to be done. So that would be my recommendation, is to let them know that we're on their land, that we would like to invite ceremony, because that's one of the things that one of the ways we restricted them was to make it illegal for them to have ceremony. So bring in ceremony, talk to the more activist people in the community who have been doing the work to try to build or even to bust colonial practices, and really show up in a way that strips of the colonial piece and brings in the piece that honors the people who are on the land. Humility goes a long way, Stacia. So if you were to say, I know absolutely nothing of this, one way to say it is, I am as a child in this. And that's a language that they understand, a statement they understand. that says that you know absolutely nothing, that you come with the best of intentions, and you're going to follow through on what they request. And you're going to have to do it over and over and over and over again, especially working with water. So I'll stop there, but I just really, and I love seeing all these women scientists. This is so awesome. So congratulations, all of you. Thank you.
You. Now we have another question from the chat, and this one's directed to Anne. It says, are FEMA and other state/federal agencies rethinking their flood mapping standards, considering the impacts of climate change and habitat loss?
So it's a great question. And I was doing some frantic Googling just to check my absolute up-to-date facts. But as far as I know, the FEMA flood maps are not being updated at this time to account for climate change. They are updated in this sort of needs-based way, but they're not proactively going in and updating flood maps to account for climate change, although the agency does recognize that this is a challenge. I mentioned NOAA Atlas 14, which is precipitation frequency. So how often do we expect it to rain 2 inches in a given place, or what's the size storm that you can expect to happen once every 10 years? So those standards are really important for designing infrastructure like bridges and culverts and stormwater management structures. And NOAA is actually updating Atlas 14 to account for climate change in the first for the first time. And so I'll drop a link into the chat about these updates that are coming down the road in the next couple of years, which are going to be potentially super helpful in thinking about how we build our cities and design our infrastructure in the face of a changing climate.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yeah.
Yeah, this question is for Georgina. Georgina, you mentioned that there's this paradox happening in Puerto Rico where the development is continuing despite a population decline, and it's happening in areas that are directly adjacent to more wild spaces. And so I'm wondering, through the development of this project, how that sort of tension is being discussed, particularly with the rich ecological diversity throughout the country.
So, well, of course, keep in mind that we're at a very, very early stage, so much so that we haven't officially started. But the idea here is really for us to be able to characterize how trends are likely to happen based on new events that are part of our societies nowadays and things that we have seen in the past. So of course you are all familiar with Airbnb and this boom in development that is effectively associated with it. Puerto Rico and many other communities have been impacted by recent trends, recent economic trends. We all like to be nearby natural amenities. So this balancing between, we want to be nearby areas that are close to wild environments and are beautiful and they provide us natural amenities. That's part of what we want to include into the model so that we can understand better and better guide conservation efforts. So the core focus here would be to include local realities, to be able to characterize what effects, what parameters, what conditions really drive growth in one specific region. And in this case, of course, we're looking at the case of depopulation, but still a depopulation, that an area that is experiencing depopulation and also this growth in development extent. So the idea is to capture that. Of course, we see that in areas like Puerto Rico happens nearby beautiful environments, natural environments that are critically important from ecological processes. So what we want truly is to understand how those may happen and what is the likelihood of these changes to happen across the space and time. Yep.
We have another question in the chat. This is for Catherine. Can you elaborate how funding amounts are determined for those who are being paid for lands in flood zones? Thank you.
Yeah, so they are paid they're evaluated by a third party, and a third party appraiser will come in and will determine a pre-disaster rate for the home post-disaster. So it is a little questionable, but typically the local government will hire a third party appraiser who will come in, they'll give the homeowner a quote for the house. From what I understand, there's not a lot of space for negotiation on that housing price. I think I mentioned that some of the programs can look a little different. So a lot of the local governments, some governments will allow sort of a price negotiation and others won't, or some other local governments. So in Harris County, they'll offer some extra funds for like closing costs or support for other things post relocation. But in terms of housing price, it is typically evaluated by a third party appraiser, and they set what would be a pre-flood price to the house.
Prices like fair market value, or is there kind of some other standard that's used there?
Sorry, I think I missed the beginning of your question.
Are those prices that they give, are they like fair market value? Is like this what you could have sold the house for, or is there like some other standard that's used there? Do you know?
I think it depends. You know, I think literature is pretty scattered on, you know, whether or not prices given are fair market prices for houses, or whether or not, you know, again, it's sort of this conflict of a lot of the times, you know, a lot of funding for buyout programs happen after a natural hazard declaration. And so a lot of these storms and a lot of these appraisers are coming out after a major storm. So to know really the condition of what the house was in order to give a fair market value at a pre-flood condition, I'm not really sure. Yeah, there's certainly some literature out there that says that non-fair market values are often given, and then there's pretty strict guidelines around whether or not you can negotiate for that. So there's certainly the literature on buyouts is certainly mixed on yeah, whether or not they're a just flood mitigation solution, or whether or not they're just like a way to push people out of flood zones to stop paying flood insurance.
Thank you so much. We have time for maybe one more question if anybody has any final questions. We got one. Okay. It says, Catherine, are these houses and areas overlaid with federal acquisition boundaries? So would federal agencies such as U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or MPS be able to acquire those lands?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure about who can acquire them, if federal agencies can acquire them afterwards. I do know, you know, there's a lot of differences. Like I believe it's like with FEMA funding, other private landowners are not allowed to purchase the land after somebody's been bought out. So, you know, there are certain grants that pay for buyouts that keep it from being developed in the future. I think typically it becomes like local city land, but that's a good question. I'm not actually sure if an agency would be able to buy it from the local government, but that's certainly a good question to look into.
Yeah, Georgina.
As a follow-up to that, Catherine, so that implies that after a buyout, depending on which program you applied for, the land could be repurposed for further residential development, or yes.
Yeah, I think there are some programs that don't necessarily have conditions to it that they're not allowed to resell it to a developer. But some of the more common programs and the FEMA funding, like through BRIC, don't allow that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, I think the question and answer session is about done. We've got 5 more minutes. Mia, would you like to come back on and share the screen and bring us home?
Well, I want to start by extending immense gratitude to all of our wonderful panelists for sharing their research and their insights into urban climate adaptation strategies. This session, we witnessed a diversity of challenges that are faced by urban communities and ecosystems in the midst of changing climate, whether it was wildfires or flooding, dwindling water resources. But it sounds like amidst these challenges, there will also be the ingenuity of researchers and communities addressing these challenges together. So thank you again to all of our panelists and to the engaged audience who had a great round of insightful questions for our Research Spotlights panel. As the Urban Climate Adaptation Symposium comes to a close, I want to thank the amazing speakers we've heard from throughout the event, which started over 3 hours ago now, including Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Brain, Director Applegate, Dr. Sachin Shah, and Dr. Jola Ajibade. Many thanks to our Equitable Partnerships Session panelists, Tanya Sirk, Dr. Sean Fisher, and Chantel Jimenez. And thanks to the incredible team of staff and collaborators who really pulled it through to make this event a reality. It was many, many months in the making. Our steering committee members and technical and accessibility support were key into making this event a success. So we hope our participants and audience have found this to be a very rich discussion and that these conversations have encouraged other researchers in the audience, resource managers to consider urban systems in their work and to really develop a deeper understanding of ethical research engagement practices with underserved urban communities. Finally, I want to remind everyone about the post-event discussion session that will be starting at 4:30 p.m. Eastern, so in a little over 15 minutes. The last I checked, there might have been 2 spots left. So if there are any spots left, be sure to head to the event webpage, register for that event at the bottom of the page. And we look forward to continuing this conversation over the next hour or so, and certainly in the days and months ahead. And with that, thank you everyone for joining. Really appreciate it.